The morning of June 7, 1942, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching smoke rise from Midway Island on the horizon. 4 of Japan's finest carriers had just delivered a devastating blow to American positions. The strike had been flawless, executed by pilots whose training represented years of intensive preparation. Yet Genda felt no triumph. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 6 months earlier, those same pilots had shattered the American battle line at Pearl Harbor. They had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse. They had driven the Royal Navy from Southeast Asia. They had swept Allied forces from the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with a speed that stunned the world. The mathematics of naval warfare seemed to confirm Japan's supremacy. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 8 operational aircraft carriers. The Americans had perhaps 3 left in the Pacific. Then the radar operator's voice crackled through the radio. American dive bombers inbound. High altitude. Multiple contacts. What happened in the next 5 minutes would validate a warning that Japan's leadership had ignored for 2 years. A warning delivered by the one man who truly understood what Japan faced. Admiral Yamamoto had spent years studying in America. He had walked through the factories of Detroit. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He had watched cargo ships being loaded in American ports with the efficiency that made Japanese operations look medieval. And he had told his government something they refused to believe, that if war came, Japan would have perhaps 6 months to achieve total victory. After that, American industrial capacity would awaken, and when it did, Japan would drown in a flood of ships, planes, and weapons produced at a scale that defied comprehension. The dive bombers struck at 10:30 that morning. In 5 minutes, they transformed the Pacific War. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, erupted in flames. A 4th, Hiryu, would burn that evening. Half of Japan's carrier strength vanished in a single morning, but the real catastrophe wasn't what Japan lost at Midway, it was what America could replace. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Naval General Staff had built their entire war strategy on a single assumption, that Japan needed only 70% of America's naval strength to achieve victory. The logic seemed sound. Japan would fight defensively, choosing battlegrounds close to home where supply lines favored Japanese forces. American ships would have to cross 5,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, suffering attrition from submarines and land-based aircraft before reaching the decisive battle zone. The calculation incorporated detailed analysis of American naval construction capacity. Japanese intelligence had thoroughly studied American shipyards during the 1930s. Their reports concluded that American yards required approximately 8 to 9 months to complete a cargo vessel using traditional construction methods. For warships, the timeline stretched to 2 or 3 years for cruisers, 4 years for battleships, and 3 years for aircraft carriers. These estimates formed the foundation of Japan's war planning. If Japan could sink American ships faster than American yards could replace them, attrition would force a negotiated peace. The Imperial Navy's submarine force would target merchant shipping, surface raiders would hunt isolated convoys, land-based bombers would strike at American logistics. The mathematics seemed inexorable. If Japan sank 10 American ships monthly and America could build only 8 replacements, Japanese victory became a matter of time. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, had articulated this strategy in planning documents captured after the war. The Americans possess superior industrial resources, but industrial capacity requires time to mobilize. Our task is to inflict such severe losses in the war's first year that American public opinion demands peace before their factories can tip the balance. We calculated that America would require 12 months minimum to mount a significant counteroffensive after Pearl Harbor. But there was one man in Japan's leadership who knew these calculations were catastrophically wrong. Admiral Yamamoto had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy in 1904. He had served with distinction in the Russo-Japanese War. He had risen through the ranks during Japan's emergence as a modern naval power. And in 1919, the Imperial Navy sent him to study at Harvard University. Yamamoto spent 2 years in America, not merely attending classes but traveling extensively across the country. He visited automobile factories in Detroit, where assembly lines produced cars with a speed that seemed impossible. He watched steel being poured in Pittsburgh mills operating 24 hours daily. He saw oil derricks in Texas and shipping terminals in California and railway networks moving freight across continental distances. And he began to understand something his colleagues in Tokyo refused to accept. The American industrial system operated on principles fundamentally different from Japan's craft-based production. Where Japanese shipyards employed master builders who constructed vessels through accumulated expertise passed across generations, American factories treated ships like any other manufactured product. Components were standardized, workers were specialized, production was systematized. Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1921 with a message that made him deeply unpopular among the militarists rising to power. It is a mistake to regard Americans as luxury-loving and weak. I can tell you that they are full of spirit, adventure, fight, and justice. Their thinking is scientific and well advanced. Remember that American industry is much more developed than ours, and unlike us, they have all the oil they want. Japan cannot vanquish the United States. Therefore, we should not fight the United States. He repeated these warnings throughout the 1930s as tensions mounted. When Japan signed the tripartite pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in September 1940, Yamamoto opposed it vigorously. When military factions demanded war with America, he argued passionately for restraint. He understood what few others in Tokyo grasped. That American industrial capacity was not merely larger than Japan's, it was fundamentally different in character. His warnings grew more dire as war approached. In January 1941, he wrote to a colleague, "Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. I wonder if our politicians who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war have confidence as to the outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices." This wasn't bravado, it was desperation. Yamamoto knew Japan could not march to Washington. He knew Japan could not sustain a long war. He knew that once American industry focused on military production, Japan would face an opponent that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. But the militarists dismissed his concerns. They pointed to Japanese naval superiority, to the quality of Japanese pilots, to the fighting spirit that would compensate for material disadvantages. They believed that Bushido, the warrior code, would triumph over American commercialism. 15th, 1941, Yamamoto was promoted to full admiral. 3 weeks later, on December 7th, he executed the attack on Pearl Harbor, not because he believed it would lead to victory, but because his government had decided on war and military duty demanded he fight with everything he possessed. The attack achieved tactical brilliance. 18 American warships damaged or sunk, 347 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans killed. Japanese losses were trivial by comparison. 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines. But Yamamoto knew the truth. In his private correspondence preserved after his death, he expressed no joy at Pearl Harbor's success. The attack had given Japan perhaps 6 months before American production capacity mobilized. 6 months to win a war against an enemy with 10 times Japan's industrial potential. He had warned that the decisive battle must come quickly, that Japan must inflict such overwhelming defeats in the war's opening phase that America would negotiate rather than endure a long conflict. That strategy depended entirely on American morale collapsing before American factories could respond. Pearl Harbor guaranteed the strategy would fail. Instead of shattering American resolve, the attack unified a previously divided nation. Instead of forcing negotiations, it triggered an industrial mobilization that would validate every warning Yamamoto had delivered. By March 1942, disturbing intelligence reports began reaching Tokyo. American shipyards were not building vessels in 8 or 9 months as expected. They were completing cargo ships in times that seemed impossible. The reports came from multiple sources: Japanese submarines observing American ports, diplomatic channels still open through neutral countries, intelligence officers analyzing American newspaper accounts and radio broadcasts. The Maritime Commission, America's civilian shipbuilding authority, was constructing something called Liberty ships. Mass-produced cargo vessels built using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile factories. The first reports claimed American yards were completing these ships in 4 to 5 months. Japanese naval planners dismissed this as propaganda. 4 months was impossible using any known shipbuilding method. Traditional construction required laying a keel, building the hull frame by frame, installing machinery piece by piece, fitting out systems over weeks or months. No known technique could compress this process below 6 months without catastrophic quality problems. Then, the reports changed. By May 1942, intelligence indicated Liberty ships were being completed in under 3 months. Japanese analysts checked and rechecked their sources. They examined technical specifications to determine if these ships were actually barges or floating platforms misidentified as proper vessels. The specifications showed otherwise. Liberty ships displaced 14,245 tons fully loaded. They carried 10,800 tons of cargo. They mounted defensive weapons. They possessed adequate engines. They were real ships, built to cross oceans and deliver war material, and America was building them in 70 days on average. The mathematics began to terrify Japanese planners. 18 American shipyards were constructing Liberty ships. If each yard completed a ship every 70 days, that meant each yard produced approximately 5 ships annually. 18 yards producing 5 ships each yielded 90 ships per year. But those were just the Liberty ships. American yards were also building destroyers, cruisers, carriers, tankers, and countless auxiliary vessels. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, ordered a comprehensive assessment of American shipbuilding capacity in June 1942, immediately after Midway. The staff officers assigned to this analysis spent 3 months gathering every scrap of available intelligence. What they discovered contradicted everything Japanese war planning had assumed. American shipbuilding was not following traditional patterns. The Liberty ship program represented a complete reconception of how ships could be manufactured. Instead of craft production, Americans had implemented mass production. Instead of building ships sequentially from keel to deck, American yards were fabricating entire sections simultaneously in parallel production lines, then assembling these sections using massive cranes. The key innovation was prefabrication. While Japanese shipyards built vessels piece by piece on building ways, American facilities constructed bow sections, stern sections, engine rooms, cargo holds, and deck houses in separate workshops. When components were complete, they were positioned on the building way and welded together in hours rather than weeks. Workers weren't traditional shipwrights requiring years of apprenticeship. They were farmers, housewives, factory workers, secretaries trained in specific repetitive tasks over 2 or 3 weeks. One Liberty ship contained approximately 250,000 parts. In Japanese yards, installing these parts required months of sequential work. In American yards, the parts were pre-assembled into approximately 100 major sections, which were then joined together. What had been a 9-month process requiring comprehensive skills became a 2-month process requiring specialized repetitive operations. The intelligence report delivered to Admiral Nagano in September 1942 contained statistics that senior officers initially refused to believe. American yards had launched 48 Liberty ships in August. Projections suggested production would exceed 60 ships monthly by December. In a single year, Liberty ship production alone would exceed 400 vessels. That was more tonnage than Japan's entire merchant fleet at the war's start. But the Liberty ships were just the beginning. The same report documented American production of escort carriers, destroyer escorts, landing craft, tankers, and fleet oilers. Total American merchant and auxiliary construction for 1942 was projected at 700 vessels. For 1943, the projection exceeded 1,500 ships. By any rational analysis, these numbers were impossible. No nation in history had built ships at such a scale. Yet every piece of intelligence confirmed the projections. Photographs showed American shipyards with 7, 10, even 12 building ways operating simultaneously. Radio intercepts captured American workers celebrating production records. Neutral observers reported seeing multiple ships launched on the same day from a single facility. In November 1942, reports reached Tokyo of a particularly disturbing development. A shipyard in Richmond, California, operated by an industrialist named Henry Kaiser, had completed a Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. Japanese naval architects declared this impossible. A ship could not be built in 4 days. The report must be either propaganda or a gross exaggeration. Perhaps the Americans had pre-built most of the ship, then staged a theatrical keel laying for publicity purposes. The skepticism was understandable. Japanese shipyards required minimum 6 months to complete a comparable vessel. The idea that Americans could compress this to days defied engineering logic. Yet the intelligence kept coming, and it kept getting worse. By January 1943, American yards were averaging 42 days to complete a Liberty ship. Not as publicity stunts, but as routine production. 3 ships were being launched daily across American shipyards. The United States was producing more merchant tonnage monthly than Japan could sink with its entire submarine force, and the gap was widening. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, a submarine captain who would later sink the USS Indianapolis, documented the growing futility of Japan's commerce war in his personal diary. "We patrol for weeks to sink perhaps 1 or 2 American cargo ships. Intelligence reports that American yards replace those losses in a single day. We are bailing water from the ocean with a teacup, while they empty Lake Michigan into it with fire hoses." The human cost of Japan's miscalculation became apparent through 1943. Japanese merchant shipping, essential for moving oil from the Dutch East Indies and raw materials from Southeast Asia, was being systematically destroyed by American submarines. But unlike the Americans, who replaced losses faster than they occurred, every Japanese ship sunk was irreplaceable. Japan had entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By December 1943, 2 million tons had been sunk. New construction replaced perhaps 200,000 tons. The shortfall was catastrophic. Oil imports fell by half. Steel production declined by 30%. Aluminum production dropped by 40%. Meanwhile, American production accelerated. By mid-1943, Liberty ship construction had become so routine that American yards were launching Victory ships, an improved design with better engines and faster speeds. The production techniques pioneered on Liberty ships transferred seamlessly to these new vessels. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see how completely his warnings were validated. On April 18, 1943, American fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Codebreakers had read his flight schedule, P-38. Lightnings shot down his plane. He was 59 years old. The man who had understood American industrial capacity better than anyone in Japan's leadership died never knowing just how completely America's production would overwhelm the nation he had tried to save. By late 1943, some Japanese naval officers began to comprehend the magnitude of their strategic error. Captain Toshikazu Omai, a staff officer in the Naval General Staff, wrote a confidential assessment that circulated among senior leadership. "Our pre-war estimates of American shipbuilding capacity were not merely incorrect, They were based on fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capabilities. We assumed American shipyards would follow traditional construction methods as we do. We failed to recognize that Americans would apply mass production techniques that revolutionized manufacturing in other industries. Our intelligence focused on counting existing American shipyards and estimating traditional construction times. We never imagined they would build new shipyards designed specifically for assembly line ship production. We calculated ship construction in terms of skilled craftsmen and years of training. They calculated it in terms of specialized workers and days of training. We thought in terms of building ships. They thought in terms of manufacturing ships. By 1944, the statistical imbalance had become absurd. Japan managed to complete perhaps 50 merchant ships that year. America launched over 1,500. The United States was building more tonnage in a single month than Japan built in an entire year. The Pacific War had become a contest between craft production and mass production, between traditional methods and industrial systems, between a nation that built ships the way it had for centuries and a nation that treated ships as products to be manufactured like automobiles or refrigerators. The Liberty Ship program represented more than just American industrial capacity. It demonstrated a fundamental difference in how Americans approached problems. Where Japanese planners saw shipbuilding as a specialized craft requiring generational expertise, Americans saw it as a manufacturing challenge requiring systematized processes. Where Japanese leaders respected tradition and established methods, Americans questioned whether those methods could be improved. Where Japanese strategists planned based on how wars had always been fought, Americans adapted industrial techniques that had never been applied to warfare. Admiral Nagano, reviewing intelligence summaries in late 1944, made a note in his personal papers that captured the realization finally dawning on Japan's leadership. We believed we were fighting a naval war in which superior ships, superior pilots, and superior fighting spirit would compensate for America's larger industrial base. We did not understand we were fighting an industrial war in which superior production systems would overwhelm any tactical or operational advantages we possessed, Yamamoto warned us. We did not listen. We believed American luxury and softness would prevent them from mobilizing their full strength. We were wrong. They mobilized not just their strength but their ingenuity. They did not merely build more ships. They reinvented how ships are built. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The final accounting of the Liberty Ship program validated every fear Yamamoto had expressed. Between 1941 and 1945, American yards completed 2,710 Liberty ships. Combined with other merchant and auxiliary vessels, America built over 5,500 ships, totaling 53 million tons of capacity. Japan, in the same period, built fewer than 400 merchant vessels totaling perhaps 1.5 million tons. The ratio was 35-1, but even these numbers understated the gap. American ships were built by workers trained in weeks. Japanese ships required craftsmen trained over years. American yards could scale production simply by training more workers. Japanese yards were constrained by the available pool of experienced shipbuilders. American construction used standardized components that could be mass-produced. Japanese construction required custom fabrication of most parts. American ships were adequate rather than perfect, but adequate ships delivered cargo, while perfect ships still under construction delivered nothing. The psychology of Japan's naval officers underwent a profound transformation as the war progressed. Officers who had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy, believing in Japanese superiority, found themselves confronting mathematical realities that destroyed every assumption they carried. Commander Tamechi Hara, who survived the war to write extensive memoirs, described the cognitive dissonance that afflicted Japanese naval personnel by mid-1944. We had been taught that one Japanese pilot equaled 10 American pilots, that Japanese ships were superior to American vessels, that Japanese fighting spirit would triumph over American materialism. Then we encountered American carrier groups that launched 400 aircraft in a single strike. We saw radar-directed gunfire that hit targets in darkness. We faced ships we had reported sunk appearing again in battle 3 months later, repaired and returned to service. The Americans were not fighting the war we expected. They were fighting a different war entirely, a war of overwhelming material superiority backed by industrial systems we could not match. The carrier battles of 1944 illustrated the impossible arithmetic Japan faced. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, Japan launched every available carrier aircraft in a desperate attempt to break American naval forces. 450 Japanese planes attacked the American fleet. American combat air patrols destroyed 380 of them. American pilots, many with only 6 months of training, shot down Japanese aviators who had trained for 3 years. The difference wasn't skill, it was numbers and radar coordination. American carriers could afford losses because replacement pilots and aircraft arrived continuously. Japan's losses were irreplaceable. The Japanese lost 3 carriers that day. The Americans lost 0. But the real catastrophe wasn't the carrier losses, it was what happened afterward. American damage control teams saved ships that should have sunk. American repair facilities restored damaged vessels to service within weeks. American industrial capacity replaced aircraft losses within days. Japan had no equivalent capacity. A damaged Japanese carrier required months of repairs that often couldn't be completed due to resource shortages. Lost aircraft took weeks to replace. Killed pilots couldn't be replaced at all. By August 1944, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the training pipeline couldn't produce aviators fast enough to replace losses. American aviation training programs were graduating thousands of pilots monthly. Japanese programs graduated dozens. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could sustain losses indefinitely. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 delivered the final proof of Japan's strategic bankruptcy. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining surface fleet to a desperate gamble. If successful, Japanese battleships and cruisers would destroy American landing forces in the Philippines, potentially prolonging the war by months or years. If unsuccessful, the Imperial Navy would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. But again, the raw numbers understated the strategic reality. America could replace those losses within months. Japan had no capacity to replace anything. The Imperial Navy that had dominated the Pacific in 1942 had been reduced to a collection of damaged vessels hiding in port, unable to sortie due to fuel shortages and lack of air cover. The oil situation had become critical by late 1944. Japan had gone to war partly to secure access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. But American submarines had turned the sea lanes between the East Indies and Japan into a graveyard. Tankers that survived the journey to Japan often sat at docks unable to unload because American submarines had mined harbors. The Japanese Navy, built around fuel-intensive battleships and carriers, was immobilized not by American combat action but by inability to obtain gasoline. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer in the Combined Fleet Headquarters, documented the fuel crisis in reports that revealed how completely logistics had defeated Japanese strategy. Our battleships and carriers sit at anchor because we cannot spare fuel for training exercises. Our destroyers conduct patrols at reduced speeds to conserve oil. Our submarines return to port with torpedoes unexpended because they lack fuel to reach patrol areas. American submarines operate freely because we cannot afford fuel for extensive anti-submarine patrols. We are losing the war not through combat defeats but through industrial starvation. Every gallon of fuel we consume must be replaced by tankers running a gauntlet of American submarines. Every tanker sunk reduces our operational capacity. America builds tankers faster than we can sink them. We sink tankers faster than we can replace them. The mathematics are inexorable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of Japan's industrial failure appeared most starkly in the final year of the war. Young men volunteered for kamikaze missions not because they embraced death, but because they understood conventional tactics had become futile. Japanese pilots flying obsolete aircraft against American ships, protected by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrols, had virtually no chance of survival whether they returned to base or crashed into targets. At least the kamikaze offered a possibility of inflicting damage. The kamikaze phenomenon revealed the depth of Japan's desperation. A nation that had possessed the world's finest naval aviators in 1942 was reduced to using pilots with perhaps 40 hours of training for suicide attacks by 1945, not because Japan embraced death, but because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to provide these pilots with adequate aircraft, fuel, or training. American responses to kamikaze attacks demonstrated the industrial gap that doomed Japan. Kamikaze struck the carrier USS Franklin in March 1945, killing over 800 men and inflicting damage that would have sunk most ships. Franklin survived. Damage control teams contained fires, restored power, and kept the vessel afloat. The carrier steamed to Pearl Harbor under her own power, underwent repairs, and was preparing to return to service when the war ended. Japan had no equivalent damage control capability. A comparable hit would have resulted in complete loss. The statistical accounting of American ship production between 1941 and 1945 revealed numbers that still seem implausible. The United States built or converted 141 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan built or converted 15. America produced 349 destroyers. Japan produced 63. America launched 203 submarines. Japan launched 126. The ratios were overwhelming across every category. But even more significant than warship production was merchant shipping. The Liberty ship program that Japanese intelligence had initially dismissed as impossible propaganda delivered 2,710 vessels. Victory ships added 531 more. T-2 tankers contributed 490 vessels. Hundreds of other merchant designs brought total American merchant construction to approximately 5,500 ships. Japan, by contrast, built fewer than 400 merchant vessels during the entire war. Worse, American submarines sank Japanese merchant shipping faster than Japan could build replacements. Japan began the war with 6 million tons of merchant capacity. By August 1945, less than 1 million tons remained afloat. The Japanese war economy had been strangled not by American bombing or combat action, but by loss of merchant shipping that couldn't be replaced. The industrial comparison became even more stark when examining other war production. America built 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan built 76,000. America produced 88,000 tanks. Japan produced 6,000. America manufactured 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Japan manufactured less than 2 billion. The United States built 2,700 Liberty ships alone, while simultaneously producing everything else required for a two-ocean war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, reflected on Japanese strategic planning in his post-war writings. Japanese admirals understood naval tactics brilliantly. Their execution of carrier operations in 1942 was exemplary. Their pilots were superb, their ships were well designed, but they fundamentally miscalculated American industrial capacity. They assumed American shipyards would build ships using traditional methods. They never imagined we would revolutionize ship construction. They planned for a war in which superior Japanese quality would overcome quantitative American advantages. They didn't understand that American industry would deliver both quantity and adequate quality. They believed American democracy was weak and would negotiate after early defeats. They failed to recognize that Pearl Harbor unified America in ways nothing else could have. They thought they were fighting a naval war. They were actually fighting an industrial war. And in industrial warfare, the side that produces more weapons faster wins. The final irony of Japan's miscalculation appeared in how Japanese shipyards adopted American techniques after the war. In the 1950s, American shipbuilders taught Japanese firms the prefabrication and welding methods pioneered during Liberty ship construction. Japanese yards, freed from military production constraints, applied these techniques with characteristic efficiency. By the 1960s, Japan had become the world's largest commercial shipbuilder, using methods they had once dismissed as impossible. Elmer Hahn, a former superintendent at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard, traveled to Japan in the 1950s working for a commercial shipping company. He brought with him the large block construction techniques and assembly line methods developed during the war. Japanese engineers studied these approaches intensively. They combined American mass production techniques with Japanese quality control systems. Within a decade, Japanese shipyards were building vessels more efficiently than any other nation. The transformation was complete. The country that had lost the Pacific War, partly because it couldn't match American shipbuilding capacity, became the world's dominant shipbuilder by adopting the very techniques that had defeated it. Japanese yards built tankers and container ships using methods directly descended from Liberty ship construction. The irony wasn't lost on surviving Japanese naval officers. Admiral Ali Burke, who had fought against the Japanese Navy during the war, and later served as Chief of Naval Operations, visited Japanese shipyards in the 1960s. His observations captured the strange circularity of history. I walked through shipyards in Kure and Yokohama that were building merchant vessels using techniques Henry Kaiser pioneered in Richmond. The Japanese had taken our wartime methods, refined them, and surpassed us. They learned the lesson we taught them perhaps too well. American shipbuilding declined while Japanese yards became dominant. We won the war but lost the peace in shipbuilding. The Japanese lost the war but won the peace by mastering industrial methods that defeated them. The Liberty ship program's influence extended far beyond World War II. The prefabrication techniques, welding procedures, and mass production approaches pioneered between 1941 and 1945 became standard practice in global shipbuilding. When South Korea built its shipbuilding industry in the 1970s, engineers explicitly studied Liberty ship construction as their model. When China expanded its maritime production in the 2000s, planners examined Kaiser's assembly line methods. Modern container ships, tankers, and bulk carriers worldwide are built using direct descendants of techniques developed during the emergency program. The modular construction that seemed revolutionary in 1942 is now universal. Massive prefabricated sections are standard. Welding has completely replaced riveting. Specialized workers performing repetitive tasks have replaced generalist craftsmen. Every modern shipyard operates on principles that Henry Kaiser pioneered. But perhaps the Liberty ship program's most important legacy wasn't technical. It was conceptual. Kaiser demonstrated that perceived limitations often reflect organizational constraints rather than physical impossibilities. Shipbuilding experts believed ships required 8 months minimum construction time. Kaiser proved they could be built in weeks. Maritime engineers believed shipbuilding required years of apprenticeship. Kaiser proved specialized training could produce competent workers in weeks. Traditional builders believed quality required craftsmen. Kaiser proved standardization and systematization could deliver adequate quality at revolutionary speed. The lesson applied far beyond shipbuilding. It suggested that assumptions about production limits deserved skepticism, that conventional wisdom should be questioned, that breakthrough performance required challenging fundamental premises. These insights influenced post-war American industry across sectors. The idea that complex products could be manufactured rapidly using systematized processes became foundational in aerospace, electronics, and countless other fields. The Pacific War was ultimately decided not by carrier battles or island campaigns, but by industrial capacity. Japan entered the war believing superior training, better tactics, and greater fighting spirit would compensate for America's larger industrial base. Admiral Yamamoto had warned his government this was illusion. He had seen American factories. He had studied American production systems. He had understood that American industry, once mobilized, would overwhelm any tactical or operational advantages Japan possessed. His warnings were ignored. Japan's leadership believed what they wanted to believe, that America was soft, that democracy was weak, that materialism would collapse when confronted by Bushido. They were catastrophically wrong. Pearl Harbor didn't shatter American morale. It focused American industrial capacity on military production with results that exceeded even Yamamoto's worst fears. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had essentially ceased to exist. Not because Japanese sailors lacked courage, not because Japanese ships were poorly designed, not because Japanese admirals failed tactically, but because Japan couldn't replace losses while America replaced them faster than they occurred. Because Japan's oil tankers were sunk faster than they could be built, while American tankers were built faster than they could be sunk. Because Japanese industry was strangled by merchant shipping losses, while American merchant shipping multiplied geometrically. The mathematics were indeed inexorable, as Captain Oi had written, but they were inexorable in the opposite direction from what Japan had assumed. Japan had calculated that sinking American ships faster than American yards could replace them would force American surrender. The reality was that America built ships faster than Japan could sink them, forcing Japanese surrender. The same logic, applied to a fundamentally different industrial reality, produced opposite outcomes. The 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945 carried more than cargo across oceans. They carried the weight of American industrial capacity. They demonstrated that traditional methods could be revolutionized. They proved that perceived impossibilities might be organizational failures rather than physical limits. They validated every warning Admiral Yamamoto had delivered to leaders who refused to listen. Most profoundly, they showed that modern warfare between industrial powers would be decided not in fleet actions or decisive battles, but in factories and shipyards. The side that could produce more weapons faster would win regardless of tactical brilliance or operational skill. This was the lesson Japan learned too late and at terrible cost. It was a lesson written in the steel of ships built so quickly that experts declared them impossible. Ships that didn't just win a war but revolutionized how ships would be built forever. Admiral Nimitz summarized the Pacific War's fundamental truth in a speech delivered in 1946. "We fought across 5,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, supplied by ships built faster than the enemy could sink them." Japan's military planners assumed American industrial capacity was impressive but finite. They believed that if they sank enough ships, eventually American logistics would collapse and we would negotiate. They failed to account for Henry Kaiser and the industrial revolution he brought to shipbuilding. By 1944, we were replacing shipping losses faster than Japan could inflict them. We were building 3 ships daily. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could build faster than the enemy could destroy. Industrial capacity, not martial valor, determined the outcome. The Pacific War was won in the shipyards of Richmond, Portland, and Baltimore as much as on the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Liberty ships are mostly gone now. Some were scrapped in the 1960s. Some were sold to foreign shipping companies and operated into the 1970s. A few survived as museum ships. The SS John W. Brown serves as a museum in Baltimore. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is preserved in San Francisco. These vessels sailed to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994. 80-year-old ships steaming under their own power, proving the basic soundness of their rushed construction. But the Liberty ships' real legacy isn't the handful of survivors. It's the transformation they represented, the proof that revolutionary improvement is possible when necessity meets innovation. The demonstration that conventional wisdom about limits often reflects limited thinking rather than actual constraints. The validation of one admiral's warnings about industrial capacity that his government ignored until too late. Japanese admirals never imagined that America's shipyards could build one Liberty ship every 24 hours because they couldn't imagine shipbuilding as anything other than traditional craft production. They calculated based on how ships had always been built, not recognizing that Americans would fundamentally reimagine the entire process. They assumed industrial capacity meant building more ships using existing methods, not building ships using revolutionary methods. This failure of imagination cost Japan the war. Not immediately, not at Pearl Harbor or Midway or any single battle, but cumulatively, inexorably, as American industrial capacity mobilized and Japanese assumptions collapsed under the weight of mathematical reality. Every Liberty ship that slid down the ways at Richmond or Portland or Baltimore represented another nail in Imperial Japan's coffin, not because any individual ship was significant, but because collectively they demonstrated a production capacity that Japan could never match. The story of how American shipyards built Liberty ships faster than Japanese admirals believed possible is ultimately a story about the danger of assumptions, about the cost of dismissing warnings because they contradict comfortable beliefs, about the consequences of fighting the war you expect rather than preparing for the war that comes. Admiral Yamamoto tried to tell his government what they faced. He had seen American industry with his own eyes. He had understood its implications. But institutional momentum, nationalist pride, and optimistic assumptions overrode his warnings. Japan went to war believing what it wanted to believe, that superior quality would triumph over superior quantity, that fighting spirit would overcome industrial capacity, that America would negotiate rather than mobilize. Every assumption proved wrong, and the price was paid in ships sunk, battles lost, and a war that ended with Japan's cities in ruins and its navy at the bottom of the Pacific. The Liberty ships didn't just carry supplies across oceans, they carried the lesson that Admiral Yamamoto had tried to teach, that industrial warfare is won in factories before it's fought in battles, that assumptions about production capacity deserve skeptical examination, that warnings from those who truly understand the enemy deserve serious consideration, that wishful thinking is not strategy, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by warriors but by welders assembling ships in 42 days instead of 8 months. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.